So we had the political elected member of the European Parliament talking to us. We had the actual regulator, Philomena, talking to us, and now we're going to take the academic perspective for our next keynote. And this is by Anu Bradford. Anu is the Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organizations at Columbia Law School. And she is an expert in European Union law, digital, international trade law, and comparative law. She is probably best known for her book, The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, because this phrase, the Brussels Effect, has become a standard phrase and one that we use regularly. Anu is really very thoughtful about the intersection between Europe and the United States and has new thoughts on regulation. And we are just delighted to have her here to talk to us about her latest paper.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Fiona, and Alyssa. Fiona, both thank you for inviting me. Really terrific set of conversations, so delighted to be part of this. So let me build on the thoughts that the first panel of the day was sharing on the relationship between digital regulation and innovation, and try to really take that question head on. And let me just provoke you with this slide that is giving you a sense of the geographic location of the top 20 tech companies around the world. The blue bubbles there are companies that are based in the United States. And you see the market cap indicated within those bubbles. So if you take a quick look at and combine the market cap of Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, NVIDIA, Amazon, and Meta, we talk about 15 trillion. That is a lot. Then you see those two rather small bubbles below that, where you have two European companies that make the top 20, which are ASML and SAP. But that is not a flattering comparison for Europe. But let me show you another one that this really gives me a lot of pause. This is looking at what has happened in the last 50 years, the companies that have been founded in the US and in the EU, that have an over 10 billion market cap. And that is also a really sad graph and should really be arresting for all the Europeans. It is looking at the tech sector with the green bubbles and the other companies on the blue. But regardless, it really shows that the Europeans have a problem, either with innovation or commercializing the innovations. But here is the question. There are many who say that the Europeans, and this is something that Andreas Schwab started with today, that this is saying how the Americans are innovating, the Europeans are regulating. And yes, there is truth to the Europeans regulating. But what I want to challenge is that there is somehow this notion that you have a choice, that then the Europeans have made a choice to regulate, which means they cannot innovate. And Americans are innovating because they have made the choice not to regulate. So to me, that is the false choice. So that's the newest paper that Fiona was referring to. So this is basically looking at just the wave of European digital regulation. And it's setting the topic of this conference, the DMA, into context. So DMA is one of the most prominent ones, but there's a lot more there that is coming to the way of the tech companies. AI Act, the DSA, coming on the top of the GDPR, the Data Acts, and so forth. But the question is whether these are incompatible, whether the Europeans can pursue the protection of digital rights, consumer welfare, create a democracy through the governance of these platforms, and at the same time, whether they can innovate. And I see now sort of two potential threats to Europe's commitment, its own commitment to its digital agenda. One is this external pressure that is now coming from the United States. The tech companies are growing increasingly assertive, especially when they're trying to align with the sympathetic administration and trying to get the Trump administration to do their bidding and help them fight the regulations in Brussels. But the Europeans are also losing some of their own confidence because in this turbulent world, the Europeans are now laser focused not just on issues like your digital rights, but the European fundamental strategic autonomy, its digital sovereignty, its ability to make its own choices about its digital destiny. That means Europeans need to be more competitive. So there are also voices within the Europe that are now harnessing this fear and saying that, look, we have a choice and we need to stop just regulating. So let me now try to use the time that I have to make the argument that digital regulation is not the reason I showed you those two graphs in the beginning. Even if the Europeans had never enacted the GDPR, those graphs would not look different. And 5 years from now, if we now decided that the AI Act wasn't a good idea after all, and none of these other digital regulation and didn't really enforce them, it's not that they would look that different if there's nothing else than the Europeans did. So that would not be the path to European digital sovereignty and greater competitiveness. So let me try to offer you then an alternative explanation of what those first two graphs that I showed tell you, and what, in my view, actually explains the Americans' ability to create more powerful tech companies. So if it's not digital regulation, I think there are many other reasons. So first, and this is not yet this graph, but it was mentioned earlier, I thought Brian's comment as an entrepreneur were really brilliant, saying that there's no single market. There's 27 separate markets where you need to try to scale. It's very hard for a tech company in Europe. You face different languages. It was much easier for Amazon to start as a bookseller in the US when the demand for English-speaking books was near uniform. That's not the case in Europe. The same for the Netflixes of the world. The Americans in Michigan and Virginia watch often the same kinds of movies, more so than somebody in Latvia and Portugal. Again, not the story of digital regulation, the story of an absence of a digitally integrated single market. There are also, we can't really do much about the language, and those cultural preferences don't change fast. But there are many legal differences that form obstacles that would need to be removed. Second is this particular picture that comes from the Draghi report, is the differences in venture capital. So the European tech companies cannot fund their innovations in Europe the same way American companies can tap into robust, deep, integrated capital markets. So that is a very powerful reason why the European companies, after a while, they may do well in the first few funding rounds, but after a while, they need to turn to US venture capital, or they are acquired by the US tech giants because they don't have that money in Europe. And this is how Draghi in the report is highlighting in the gray the availability of venture capital in the US versus then the blue bars in Europe. And it's not just even the venture capital, it's just the entire ecosystem, how the venture capital industry works. And just to give you one example, who are the partners in these venture capital firms in the US? 60% of them are former founders, are former executives. In Europe, it's 8%. They have a very different experience to fund these companies in the US. Again, much bigger story than the idea that digital regulation will be stifling the Europeans. So venture capital is the second one. Then there's a third element to this, which is you cannot really pursue disruptive innovations unless you feel that you can afford to take those risks. It's really risky business. And that's very hard in Europe because there are legal and cultural barriers to risk-taking. Bankruptcy laws in Europe are punitive. If you look at some OECD studies, the most forgiving bankruptcy laws are in the United States, in Canada, in Turkey. Where are the most punitive ones? Sweden, the Czech Republic, Portugal, other European countries. You try something really hard, you start your company and you go under. Guess what you've done? You're never gonna raise money again. Whereas here, it's built into this whole venture capital model that you do hard things. You raise money, you start your company, you go through bankruptcy, then you go and ask more money, and guess what? They give you more money because it seems like you're working on big things. It's a really big mental attitude that is different. So bankruptcy is one thing. And then the fourth issue that I would want to highlight is the idea that in the United States, the country has been phenomenally successful in attracting the best innovators from around the world. The brain drain to the United States is really significant. So if you look at over $1 billion startups in the US, over 50% of those have an immigrant founder. If you just focus for a moment on the big tech companies, the gatekeepers that we've been talking about in this conference and their founders, just think about it. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, second-generation Cuban. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, South African. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, Brazilian. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, Russian. Again, this is not the story that Americans have shielded these companies from digital regulation. They've done some much, much bigger and more helpful. They have used the ability of the Americans to convince the rest of the world that this is the best place for them to come and innovate. They can fund their innovations here. We have the best universities of the world that are the gateways for that talent to come to the United States. So let's talk a little bit about the global talent, because that I think is a really important part of this, the explanations when we go through them. So the universities are exceptional, but also if you look at the STEM degrees, the master's and PhD degrees that we give out in the United States, over 50% go to the ones who are not Americans by their initial nationality. Over 70% of those stay after graduating, benefiting the US job market. I show you a couple of slides now, what it means in the AI space. There's different ways to measure where talent is located in the AI. I like this particular study where these researchers had looked at the most prestigious AI research conference in the world called New RIPS. There's about 13,000 plus papers submitted every year from all around the world. And top 20 of those, the 20% get accepted. So these researchers use that top 20% as a proxy for where the global talent is. What are the institutions where those individuals work? And then what I'm showing here, they looked at top 2%. They were the ones who were given a chance to present their findings orally. That's the elite AI researchers. And you look at here, if we focus on the right side, on the more recent figures, the United States dominates. The top two institutions are Google and Stanford, where these researchers work. So you see over 57%, actually I don't have my glasses on, but I think it's 57% that percentage there in the end. But the next slide is more interesting. The researchers then looked at where did these elite researchers, after having found their way to these US institutions, get their undergraduate degree from? It's a very different story. Much smaller percentage come from the United States, and a large percentage comes from China. Almost the same percentage as the ones coming from the US. So this just shows how big of a role immigration has played in the US in channeling the talent to the tech companies. So here is one thought that I have about that. So now that the Trump administration is looking to drastically scale back on immigration, that is an opportunity for continents like Europe to roll out the red carpet, because these AI researchers will be going somewhere. China is ready to welcome them back, but the Europeans should also see that in parallel to thinking about how to grow the European competitiveness, to continue to focus on the digital regulatory agenda, but also then do the hard work of identifying what is going on with the digital single market that prevents the companies today from scaling. Truly now push for that capital markets union, but also make sure that you do the other things that needs to be done around the capital markets union. Let me give you one example. Who gives money to these venture capital funds? Well, in Europe, there are many barriers for instance, pension funds to invest in risky venture capital. That should be on top of their regulatory agenda. Then rethink the bankruptcy laws, and finally find a way to seize the moment if the US no longer welcomes the talent in the United States, that the Europeans could make sure that they are the destination for all this talent. So let me maybe end it there with my invitation for all the European decision makers. We don't have Andreas Schwab here anymore in the room, but that's the conversation that I try to have when I go to Europe, is that ultimately the threat is not that they remain laser focused on regulations like the DMA that are seen to be in the best interest of Europe, and I think they are in the best interest of the wider world. They are only a risk if they sub all the energy from Europeans focusing at the same time on these other fundamental reforms that are absolutely necessary to build a thriving tech ecosystem in Europe. So thank you so much.